The moving truck rolled up to my lake house 10 days after my brother's wedding, and according to Chelsea, the first thing she noticed was the coffee. Two strangers were sitting on my deck with ceramic mugs in their hands, eating breakfast in the morning sun like they had been doing it for years. Chelsea climbed out of the passenger side and stared at them, while Jake stayed near the truck. She asked who they were. The woman at the table looked genuinely confused and said, "We live here." I wasn't there that morning. What I'm telling you about that driveway came later, from Chelsea herself, and from what the buyers told my broker. But everyone agreed on one detail. After those 3 words, Chelsea slowly turned toward my brother, and whatever expression Jake gave her was enough to make her stop asking questions for a few seconds. Before I tell you what happened next, I hope you're doing well, wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because what looked like an entitled bride demanding an expensive wedding gift turned into something much bigger than a house, and the truth had been building inside my family for years. And if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, consequences, and people finally learning where the line is, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the end. 10 days earlier, on the first Saturday in June, I had been sitting at Jake and Chelsea's wedding reception, with no idea that my lake house was about to become part of the entertainment. The ballroom was elegant without being ridiculous. All white flowers, soft lighting, polished glassware, and a dance floor already crowded with relatives who had been drinking champagne since cocktail hour. I was 38, 4 years older than Jake, and I had spent the day doing exactly what I believed a sister should do at her brother's wedding. I smiled for photographs, helped our mother find the earrings she thought she'd lost, fixed a last-minute seating problem without telling the bride, and kept my opinions about the wedding budget entirely to myself. I was there to celebrate Jake. I had no intention of creating a scene. The speeches had been going on for several minutes when Chelsea took the microphone. She was glowing, and I don't mean that sarcastically. She looked happy. I had known her long enough to recognize the difference between her public smile and a real one, and that night it was real. She thanked her parents, thanked mine, made a joke about Jake nearly forgetting the rings, and then turned toward my table. "And Lauren," she said, smiling directly at me, "we'll move into your lake house after the honeymoon. Thanks for the wedding gift." For half a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. Then the ballroom erupted. People clapped. Someone behind me shouted, "Best sister ever!" An aunt across the room raised her champagne glass. One of Jake's friends actually whistled. That reaction told me something before anyone else said another word. This was not the first time they had heard about my supposed gift. Too many people reacted as though Chelsea had just announced something already settled. Nobody turned toward me in surprise. Nobody asked if she was joking. They were celebrating a decision they believed I had already made. I looked at Jake. That was the moment everything changed for me. My brother wasn't shocked, embarrassed, or scrambling to stop his new wife. He was leaning back in his chair with a smile on his face. When our eyes met, he lifted his glass toward me in a tiny toast, like we were partners in some private arrangement, and Chelsea had simply made it public. Jake knew. More than that, he had expected this. I could feel dozens of faces turning toward me, waiting for the generous older sister to stand up and complete the performance. I didn't. I picked up my glass, looked first at Chelsea, and then at Jake, and said, "Safe travels." A few people laughed because they thought I was being dry. Chelsea smiled even wider. Jake's shoulders relaxed. I let them have that moment, because I wasn't going to turn my brother's wedding reception into a property dispute in front of everyone he knew. That wasn't fear, and it wasn't surrender. There was nothing to debate in that ballroom. The house was mine, and the next morning I intended to make that fact very clear in writing. About 20 minutes later, I stepped into a quieter corridor outside the ballroom and checked my phone. There was an email from my broker waiting near the top of my inbox. The lake house had been quietly on the market for about 5 weeks. A serious buyer had already toured it, provided proof of funds, reviewed the disclosures, and moved through most of the due diligence. That morning, while everyone else was getting ready for the wedding, they had submitted their final revised all-cash offer. I had accepted it before leaving for the ceremony. The email I was reading confirmed that the property was now under contract. I stood there for a moment, staring at the screen, and almost laughed at the timing. Jake and Chelsea believed they had just publicly cornered me into giving them a house with a sale price of $6.8 million. They had no idea that hours before Chelsea picked up that microphone, I had already agreed to sell it to someone else. The decision had nothing to do with them. I had started the sale process weeks earlier for my own reasons, and I had not told Jake because I did not discuss every financial decision I made with my family. Until that night, I hadn't imagined anyone thought they had a vote. I put my phone away and went back into the reception. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't imagining Chelsea standing beside a moving truck or wondering how Jake would explain himself. At that point, I assumed this was an ugly misunderstanding that could be corrected with one clear conversation. That assumption lasted maybe 15 minutes. Chelsea found me near the dessert table, wrapped both arms around me, and said, "Thank you." Seriously, Jake told me you might act annoyed at first. But he said not to worry. I pulled back enough to look at her. He said I'd act annoyed? Chelsea gave me a slightly embarrassed smile, as if she had accidentally revealed part of a surprise. You know, Jake, he said you're very private about money, and you'd probably hate him announcing it, but that you always come around once the drama dies down. I didn't answer immediately. What bothered me was not that Jake had predicted I would object. What bothered me was that he had already given Chelsea instructions for how to interpret my objection. Before I had ever said no, he had taught her that my no would not mean no. Chelsea was called away before I could press further, and a few minutes later my mother took her place. Susan had always been able to detect tension without admitting she had helped create it. She touched my arm and lowered her voice. "Please don't make anything of this tonight." "Make anything of what?" She gave me that look mothers give when they want you to stop being precise. Chelsea's excited, and honestly, it would be nice to keep Grandma's place in the family. "It is in the family," I said. "It's mine." My mother's expression tightened. "You know what I mean." "No. Actually, I don't. What exactly do you think I promised Jake?" She glanced toward the dance floor instead of answering. Jake and Chelsea were surrounded by friends, smiling beneath a wash of warm light while everyone celebrated them. Mom squeezed my hand and said, "Not tonight, Lauren. Please. Let your brother have his wedding." I could have forced the conversation. I could have walked straight over to Jake and demanded an explanation in front of everybody. Instead, I looked at my mother, then at my brother across the room, and made a different decision. I would let the wedding finish. In the morning, there would be no champagne, no cheering relatives, and no microphone turning a lie into a performance. There would be a written record and a simple statement of fact. But as I watched Jake laughing with his new wife, one question kept getting louder in my head. Chelsea hadn't misunderstood one careless comment. Jake had anticipated my objection before she ever made the announcement, and my own mother was already talking as though the house had some destiny I had failed to honor. I went to that wedding thinking my brother and I disagreed about a piece of property. I left realizing I didn't yet know what story he had been telling about me, how long he had been telling it, or how many people already believed it. I woke up the next morning before 7, made coffee, and opened my laptop before I answered a single family message. My phone already showed photographs from the reception, congratulations in the family group chat, and one message from an aunt telling me I had given Jake and Chelsea the most beautiful start imaginable. That told me how quickly the story had spread. I wasn't interested in correcting every relative before breakfast, but I was going to make sure the two people planning to move into my property could never later claim they had misunderstood me. I opened a new message addressed to both Jake and Chelsea, and kept it deliberately short. I told them I had not given them the lake house as a wedding gift, that I was the sole legal owner, that the property was already under contract to be sold, and that they had no ownership or occupancy rights. I also told them not to send movers, furniture, deliveries, contractors, or anyone else to the property. Then I read it twice, removed one sentence that sounded angrier than necessary, sent it, and saved a copy with the delivery confirmation. Jake called less than 15 minutes later. I could hear airport noise behind him, so I knew he and Chelsea were already on their way out of town. He didn't say good morning. he said. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I closed my laptop and took my coffee to the kitchen counter, because I knew immediately this was not going to be a short conversation. Jake accused me of embarrassing Chelsea, ruining the first morning of their marriage, and deliberately waiting until after the reception to reveal that I was selling the house. I reminded him that there had been nothing to reveal because I had never told either of them the house was theirs. He said, "Everybody understood it was coming back to me eventually." I asked him one question. Coming back from what? He went quiet for a second, then changed direction. He said Grandma had always wanted the house kept in the family. He said Chelsea and he wanted children someday, while I didn't have any. He said the place was too big for one person anyway, and that I barely used it compared with how much a young family could. Every argument sounded different, but they all depended on the same assumption. My ownership mattered only until someone else in the family decided they had a better use for what I owned. I told him Grandma's wishes did not create an invisible second deed, and future children did not give him a present claim to my property. Jake sighed like I was being intentionally difficult. "Why does everything have to be legal language with you? We're family." I told him that family was exactly why he should have asked before promising my house to his wife. He lowered his voice then, and I could tell Chelsea was probably nearby. "Just don't close anything until we get back. We'll sit down and work this out like adults." That sentence irritated me more than the shouting had, because he was speaking as though there were a mutual decision left to make. I told him the sale had been in motion for weeks before his wedding announcement, and I was not stopping it to rescue him from something he had told Chelsea without my consent. Jake said I was proving exactly what he had always said about me. I asked what that was. He answered, "That you'd rather be right than be family," and hung up. Chelsea contacted me about an hour later. Her message was much less aggressive. She asked if we could talk privately before they boarded. When she called, she sounded shaken rather than angry, and for the first time I understood that the announcement at the reception had not been some drunken joke. She told me they had ordered bedroom furniture, a dining table, and several pieces specifically measured for rooms at the lake house. They had booked movers for shortly after their honeymoon. More importantly, they had already given notice on their apartment because Jake had told her there would be no reason to renew the lease. I sat down while she was speaking. Until then, I had assumed my brother had exaggerated something to impress his bride. I had not realized he had encouraged her to reorganize their actual housing around the lie. I didn't mock her. However much I disliked what she had done with that microphone, losing a place to live wasn't funny. I asked Chelsea the question Jake had apparently trained everyone around him not to ask. "Did he ever show you anything?" She didn't understand at first. I clarified. "A deed, an agreement, an option, a letter from me. Anything in writing saying he owns part of the house or that I'm required to give it to him." There was another pause. Chelsea finally said no. Jake had told her the paperwork was in my name because I had handled things years earlier, but that everyone in the family understood what was supposed to happen once he settled down. I asked whether she had ever heard that from me. Her voice tightened. She said, "Not exactly." Then she reminded me of a conversation we'd had months earlier when she said they would probably spend more time at the lake after the wedding. I remembered it. I had told her I was reconsidering what I wanted to do with the property. Chelsea had apparently gone back to Jake and asked whether that meant I planned to sell. Jake told her I always became vague about money whenever paperwork was still being finished, and that I would come around. Looking back, that was the moment she should have asked me directly. She knew it too. But she was about to leave on her honeymoon. Her suitcase was already checked, and the alternative was admitting that the home she had been planning around might never have been hers. She said, almost pleading, "Jake says you're angry because of the way I announced it. He says once everyone cools down, you'll work something out." I told her the email I had sent was not anger. It was information. I told her again that the property was under contract and that she should make alternative plans for their belongings and housing before they returned. Chelsea didn't argue with me after that, but she didn't say she believed me either. Before we ended the call, she said, "I'm going to talk to Jake." I wished her a safe trip. Then, I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the blank screen of my laptop, and realized that Jake's lie had moved past family gossip. He had converted it into furniture receipts, a terminated lease, a moving reservation, and a wife who was now caught between what her husband had promised and what the legal owner had just told her directly. Later that morning, I spoke with my broker and the closing professional handling the transaction. I didn't tell them my family drama because they didn't need it. I asked practical questions. The buyers had already provided proof of funds. Title was clean. Most of the due diligence had been completed before the final offer was accepted, and the buyers wanted a fast closing. If the remaining documents stayed on schedule, we were looking at the following Monday. Nobody promised me that nothing could go wrong, and I didn't ask for that promise. Real estate transactions can stumble over small things at the worst possible moment. What mattered was that this wasn't a casual offer I could simply pretend had never happened because my brother was uncomfortable. Two unrelated buyers had made plans and committed resources based on a contract I had voluntarily accepted. My mother called Monday afternoon. By then, Jake and Chelsea were out of the country, and I had hoped the physical distance might cool everyone down. Instead, Susan started with the sentence I had been expecting. "Can't you just delay the closing?" I asked why. She said, "Until they're back. Let them move their things in, and then the four of us can talk this through." For several seconds, I thought I had misheard her. I asked if she was seriously suggesting that I allow two people with no ownership rights to move into a property I was contractually selling to someone else, because putting them inside might somehow improve their negotiating position. Mom became defensive. "I'm saying once everyone's face to face, maybe you'll remember this isn't just a business deal." I told her it was absolutely a business deal to the buyers, who had done nothing wrong and were paying millions of dollars for a house they expected to receive empty. She said Jake had always believed the property would eventually come back to him. I asked why he believed that. Mom said, "Lauren, don't pretend you don't understand. After everything that happened, we all knew what was supposed to happen." That sentence stopped me. Not because it changed anything about the house, but because it revealed how much larger the problem was than Jake. I had thought my brother had invented a story for Chelsea. Now my mother was speaking as though some family agreement existed that I had somehow violated by making a decision about my own property. I asked her carefully, "What exactly did Jake tell you I promised?" Mom didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was almost offended that I needed the explanation. "Not promised," she said. "But we all know what was supposed to happen." By then I knew two things with absolute certainty. Jake had told Chelsea something he couldn't prove, and my mother had been helping him believe he didn't need to. My mother's words stayed with me after we hung up. She hadn't said Jake still owned the house. She hadn't even claimed I had promised to return it. What she had said was more slippery than either of those things. We all knew what was supposed to happen. By Tuesday morning, I decided I was done arguing with conclusions. I wanted to know what facts everyone was using to reach them. I called Mom first because she was the one who had made the family understanding sound almost official. I asked her to tell me, from beginning to end, what she believed had happened with the lake house years earlier. She immediately became defensive. "Why are you interrogating me?" she asked. I told her I wasn't. I was asking because Chelsea believed Jake had some route back into ownership, and I wanted to know whether Mom believed the same thing. That finally got her attention. She admitted something important almost immediately. "Of course I know Jake sold his share to you," she said. "Nobody is pretending there wasn't paperwork." I let that sentence sit for a moment, before asking what she thought happened after that. Mom said Jake had been under tremendous financial pressure at the time, that he was trying to build a business, and that I had been in a much stronger position. According to her, I knew my brother would eventually regret selling. She said it as if regret had somehow been written into the transaction itself. "Regret isn't ownership, Mom," I said. She sighed and told me I was doing what I always did, reducing family matters to technical definitions. I asked what definition she preferred. If Jake sold something, received money for it, and no longer owned it, What exactly was I supposed to call that 6 years later? Mom didn't answer directly. Instead, she said Grandma had loved the idea of all of us gathering there, that Jake wanted children, and that I was treating something emotional like a line on a balance sheet. I reminded her that emotional meaning had never stopped the property taxes from arriving. The more she talked, the clearer her version became. She did not believe Jake legally owned the house. She believed I had a moral obligation to correct a decision he now regretted, because I had been the more financially stable sibling when he made it. That distinction mattered. Jake hadn't convinced my mother that the old transaction never happened. He had convinced her that the transaction should not count forever. I called my father that afternoon. Michael had always been easier to talk to, because he hated drama. Although I was beginning to understand that avoiding drama was not necessarily the same thing as handling it well. I asked him the same question I had asked Mom. "What do you think happened with the lake house?" Dad answered without hesitation. "Jake sold you his half. There was no discussion of temporary arrangements, moral ownership, or family expectations. To him, it was apparently that simple." "Then why does Chelsea think I'm holding it for him?" I asked. Dad was quiet for a few seconds. He said he didn't know exactly what Jake had told her. I asked whether he knew Mom believed the house was eventually supposed to return to Jake. His answer was slower this time. "Your mother has always felt he sold too soon." I told him that wasn't what I had asked. He admitted he knew Susan talked about the house as if Jake deserved another chance at it, but he said he had never taken those comments literally. That irritated me more than I expected. "Chelsea took them literally," I said. Dad told me he hadn't realized things had gone that far. He had assumed everyone understood the legal ownership, and that the rest was just Mom being sentimental, and Jake complaining about a decision he wished he could undo. I asked why he had never bothered to correct either of them. He said, "Because I thought they knew the difference between being upset and actually owning something." That evening, Chelsea video called me from the hotel where she and Jake were spending their honeymoon. She was sitting near a window with the curtains partly open behind her, and she looked more tired than she had at the wedding. She apologized for bothering me while they were away, then asked if I would answer one question without getting angry. I told her I wasn't angry with her for asking questions. I was angry that those questions had not been asked before a ballroom full of people had been told I was giving away my house. Chelsea took that without arguing. Then she told me exactly what Jake had said. According to him, years earlier he needed liquidity for his business plans, so I took title to the property because I was better positioned financially. He had told her the family understood that the arrangement wasn't supposed to permanently cut him out. Once he was married, stable, and ready to build a family, he would have a path back in. Chelsea said Jake never described it as a formal option or contract. He described it as something everyone understood. "Did he tell you I agreed to that?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "He said you wouldn't say it that way." I almost admired the construction of it. Jake had created a claim that could survive my denial because my denial had already been included as part of the claim. If I said no agreement existed, that only proved I was being technical. If I objected publicly, that proved I was annoyed. If I sold the house, that proved I cared more about money than family. Chelsea told me she had started replaying conversations from the last year and realizing how often Jake spoke about the house without ever using words like deed, contract, or ownership. He talked about what would happen when they moved in. He talked about which rooms would need updating. He talked about bringing their future children there. He had made the outcome feel settled without ever explaining what legal mechanism was supposed to produce it. Chelsea admitted she had wanted the story to be true badly enough that she stopped examining the missing pieces. The next morning, Jake called me himself. His tone was calmer than it had been at the airport, which usually meant he had decided anger wasn't getting him what he wanted. I told him Chelsea had explained the arrangement he claimed existed. Jake immediately denied using the phrase "holding it for me." He said Chelsea was simplifying years of family conversations. I asked him to simplify them for me instead. "What right do you believe you currently have to that property?" He didn't answer. He said everyone knew he would have a way back in someday. I asked what way meant. He said Grandma never wanted the house gone. I asked what that had to do with his present ownership. He told me I knew exactly what family property meant. I asked whether he had a written agreement. He accused me of sounding like a lawyer. I asked whether he had paid for an option, retained any percentage, or had any document giving him a future interest. He said I was missing the point. That was when the pattern finally became obvious. Every time I asked Jake for a fact, he retreated into a feeling. When I asked about ownership, he talked about Grandma. When I asked about an agreement, he talked about fairness. When I asked what Chelsea had been promised, he talked about family. None of those things answered the question because they weren't supposed to. They were there to make the question itself seem cruel. After that call, I did what I usually did when several people gave me incompatible versions of the same event. I opened a blank document and made a timeline. It wasn't evidence for anyone else, it was for me. Susan said Jake legally sold but deserved another chance because he had been vulnerable. Michael said Jake sold and assumed everyone knew that settled ownership. Chelsea said Jake told her I held title while he retained an understood route back. Jake refused to define the route at all. Underneath those four versions, I wrote the facts nobody had disputed. Jake once owned half the house. Jake received money when that ownership ended. I became the sole owner. Everything after those 3 points was interpretation added later. I called Dad again Wednesday evening and read him the differences without dramatizing them. He was silent for so long that I asked if the call had dropped. Then he said something he had not told me the day before. Years earlier, after hearing Jake complain that I had ended up with the house, Dad had pulled him aside and said, "You sold it. Stop talking like Lauren stole it." I asked what Jake had said. Dad told me Jake laughed it off and claimed he was only venting. For the first time, I had confirmation that Jake's version had been challenged long before Chelsea entered the family. My father had known the language was wrong. He had simply assumed it was harmless because he knew the truth himself. I asked him the question that had been bothering me since Mom's call. If you knew his version was wrong, why didn't you correct Mom? Dad exhaled slowly. I thought everybody knew the truth. That was the moment I understood how my brother's story had survived for years. It hadn't survived because there was no truth. It survived because the people who knew the truth assumed it was too obvious to defend. To understand how strange Jake's version had become, I had to go back to the last few months of 2019, when our grandmother Margaret died. The lake house did not magically become ours the morning after her funeral. Her estate had bills, accounts, legal paperwork, and other obligations that had to be handled first. An attorney worked through the administration, and for several months the house was still part of the estate. Only after that process was completed was the property formally distributed, half to Jake and half to me. By then, we weren't two grandchildren standing on a dock remembering summers with Grandma. We were two adult owners responsible for an expensive piece of real estate. That distinction mattered because the house came with more than memories. The roof was approaching the end of its useful life. Parts of the dock needed structural work. The heating system was old, the insurance wasn't cheap, and waterfront property taxes did not care how sentimental anyone felt about Sunday dinners on the deck. Jake and I split those expenses at first, but I could tell almost immediately that he hated every check he had to write. I didn't blame him for that. At the time, I wasn't even sure I wanted to keep the house myself. I loved the place, but I was practical enough to understand that loving a property and wanting to finance it for the next 30 years were two different decisions. Jake, meanwhile, was excited about something else. He had been talking for years about opening his own restaurant. He was good with people, loved food, and could make a room believe in whatever idea he was describing. Back then, that quality was one of the things I loved about him. He had found a possible location, was talking with potential partners, and believed he finally had a chance to build something of his own. What I did not know immediately was how little financial room he had left. He had personal debt, some unresolved tax obligations, and less available cash than our parents believed. Carrying half the lake house was making that tighter. Jake was the one who first brought up selling his share to me, We were standing in the kitchen at the lake house with contractor estimates spread across the counter. He pushed the papers away and told me he didn't want to spend the next several years pouring money into a roof, a dock, and a house he only used a handful of weekends a year. I asked whether he wanted us to list the entire property. He shook his head. He knew I was more attached to it than he was. And he also knew I was in a better position to carry it. Then he said something I remembered clearly because it sounded so much like Jake at that age. "I don't want a house, Lauren. I want a future." I didn't jump at the opportunity. If I was going to buy out my younger brother, I wanted the transaction clean enough that neither of us would spend Thanksgiving 10 years later arguing about whether one of us had cheated the other. I told him we needed an independent appraisal before we talked numbers. The appraisal came in around $3.1 million for the whole property, making Jake's half worth approximately $1.55 million. It was far more money than I could casually pull from a bank account, and I never pretended otherwise. My inherited half gave me substantial equity in the property. I added personal savings and financed the remainder with a loan secured by the house. It was a serious financial commitment, one I accepted because I believed the property had long-term value and because I was willing to take responsibility for the repairs Jake wanted to leave behind. Even after the financing was lined up, I gave him another chance to reconsider. I sent him an email before closing, telling him there was no emergency on my side. If he wanted more time, we could pause. If he preferred to keep his half, we would work out the expenses. If he wanted the entire property sold on the open market instead, we could discuss that too. Jake replied that he had thought it through. He understood what he was exchanging. He wanted liquidity more than he wanted real estate, and he believed the restaurant was the better opportunity for him. There was no fight between us, no ultimatum, no desperate conversation in a hospital hallway or some secret paper shoved across a kitchen table. We had an appraisal, financing, professionals handling the closing, and time to think. When the transaction closed, Jake signed the documents transferring his interest. The settlement records reflected the agreed value, and the money was paid as arranged. I became the sole owner. I remember feeling relieved when it was finished, and I won't rewrite myself into a saint just because I was eventually proven right about the paperwork. Part of me was happy the house was mine. I liked knowing I could renovate it without negotiating every repair with Jake, and I believed I was taking on an asset that could become valuable if I invested in it carefully. Jake was equally excited about having cash available for the next stage of his life. At the time, neither of us behaved like someone had won and someone had lost. We had simply chosen different futures. The only uncomfortable conversation came afterward. Jake asked me not to tell Mom everything about why he needed the money. Susan knew he wanted capital for the restaurant, but she didn't know how much pressure his personal debts and tax obligations had put on him. Jake was embarrassed. He wanted our parents to believe he was moving confidently from inherited property into a business opportunity, not cleaning up old financial problems before he could even begin. I told him his finances were his business. I wasn't going to announce his debts at a family dinner, and I wasn't going to use them against him. That wasn't sacrifice. It was basic privacy. At the time, I saw no reason to turn my brother's mistakes into public information, simply because I happened to know about them. Looking back from 2026, that was probably where the first gap opened between what happened and what our family eventually remembered. Mom knew Jake sold his share. Dad knew. Jake obviously knew. But Mom did not know how urgently he needed liquidity, and I never corrected the cleaner version he preferred to tell her. Over time, the restaurant became the brave dream he had chased, while the lake house became the valuable thing he had surrendered when he was vulnerable. Those descriptions weren't completely false. That was what made them dangerous. They left out just enough context for regret to start looking like victimhood. By Wednesday night, after speaking with Dad, I went to the cabinet in my home office and pulled out the old blue closing folder. The cardboard edges were worn, and several of the paper tabs inside had curled with age. The appraisal was where I remembered it. So were the settlement papers, financing documents, and copies of the recorded transfer. Behind them was a clipped stack of printed emails. I had printed important correspondence at the time, because I liked keeping the key communications with signed transaction records, especially when family and money were involved. I recognized the first page immediately. It was the email where I had offered Jake more time before closing, followed by his response, telling me he understood the deal and wanted to proceed. I remembered there was more beneath it, including the exchange we had after he asked me to keep his financial pressure private. My thumb rested against the corner of the final page, but I didn't turn it yet. 6 years earlier, I had filed those emails because I thought they documented a transaction that was finished. Sitting there in 2026, with my brother telling his wife one version and my mother repeating another, I began to wonder whether that old folder contained something I had forgotten was important. On Thursday morning, I went back through the blue folder from the beginning. The appraisal was still there, followed by the settlement statement and the records showing how the payment had been handled. None of it surprised me. I had lived through that transaction. What mattered was how ordinary it looked when stripped of 6 years of family emotion. The house had been appraised. Jake's share had been valued. I had arranged financing. Professionals had handled the closing. He had signed away his interest and received the agreed money. Those records did not tell me what Jake had felt when he signed, and I wasn't going to pretend they did, but they did establish something my mother had somehow allowed herself to blur over time. Jake had not walked away empty-handed, while I quietly absorbed his inheritance. He had converted his ownership into cash. Behind the settlement papers was the clipped email thread I had noticed the night before. I was about to read it when my broker called about the current sale. There were final documents to review before Monday's closing, and the buyer's side wanted confirmation about a minor item in the property disclosures. It was exactly the kind of boring administrative detail that made me appreciate how different real transactions were from family mythology. Nobody was handing me $6.8 million on Monday morning like a game show prize. There were costs, outstanding loan balances, taxes, and years of money I had already put into the property. The sale price was large, but the number everyone in my family kept repeating was not the same as profit. I dealt with the broker's questions, sent back what was needed, and returned to the folder. Before I could read the old thread, Jake called from his honeymoon. He sounded irritated before I even finished saying hello. He had apparently spoken to Mom, and now he wanted me to understand how unfair he thought the entire situation was. "You always wanted that restaurant to fail," he said. "You never believed in me. You got the house, I got nothing, and now you're making millions from it." I almost interrupted him, but I didn't. I wanted to hear how far the story had traveled inside his own head. He kept going. According to Jake, I had watched him struggle while protecting an asset that later exploded in value. If I had supported his business more aggressively, he said, maybe he would not have needed the house back now. That was when I realized he had started treating two parts of the same financial decision as if they had happened in separate universes. "Jake," I said, "where do you think the money for the restaurant came from?" He became defensive immediately. He said there had been investors, loans, and his own money. I agreed that all of those things existed, but I reminded him that after the restaurant began struggling, he had sent me financial statements and asked me to help him figure out where the cash was going. I had not invested more money because I didn't think throwing additional capital at a business with shrinking margins would solve the underlying problem. I had helped him build a repayment schedule and cut expenses instead. Jake called that proof that I never believed in him. I called it advice he had specifically asked me to give. After we hung up, I opened an old encrypted folder on my computer where I kept records from projects and financial matters I might need again. I wasn't investigating Jake. I didn't have access to anything secret. These were documents he had sent me himself when he wanted my help. There were basic restaurant statements, repayment schedules, tax notices, and a debt summary we had reviewed together one miserable Sunday afternoon. The numbers came back to me quickly. A meaningful portion of the money he received from the lake house had gone first toward cleaning up personal obligations and unresolved taxes. The rest did not disappear into vacations or sports cars. Much of it went into the restaurant, alongside outside financing and other capital. The restaurant stayed alive for several years. It had good months, bad months, and eventually more bad months than good ones. Jake had taken a real risk on something he believed in, and it had failed. There was no shame in that part. Businesses failed all the time. What bothered me was what happened afterward. Jake had slowly rewritten a business failure into a property grievance. In the new story, I had taken the valuable asset while refusing to support his dream. But the valuable asset was exactly what he had chosen to exchange for the chance to pursue that dream. He could regret the decision. He could hate the fact that the house had appreciated while the restaurant eventually closed. He could even think he had made the worst financial choice of his life. None of those feelings reversed the choice. I called Mom that afternoon and asked a simple question. Where do you think Jake got the money to open the restaurant? She sounded confused by the question. She said he had investors and business financing. I asked whether she knew the money from selling his half of the lake house had also gone into the business, after part of it cleared his personal obligations. There was a long silence. Then she said, "He told me most of the house money went toward old bills." I told her that wasn't accurate. Some did. A substantial amount helped fund and sustain the restaurant. Mom sounded genuinely surprised. She said Jake had always made it seem as if outside investors had carried most of the risk while I had refused to help him. I asked her whether she remembered me advising him when the restaurant began struggling. She said vaguely that she remembered us arguing about money. That was the problem. Jake had preserved the pieces that made him look abandoned and quietly removed the pieces that showed how much opportunity he had already received. After we ended the call, I finally returned to the printed email thread. The first messages were exactly what I remembered. I had told Jake there was no rush from my side and offered him more time before closing. His reply said he had made his decision and wanted to proceed. A few pages later came the message, I had almost forgotten. Jake wrote that he understood once he signed the transfer, the house would belong to me. Not partly to him, not temporarily to me, mine. He said he needed the cash more than he needed the property, and believed the restaurant was where his future was. Then, in the next paragraph, he asked me not to tell Mom how much pressure he was under, or how badly he needed the money. He didn't want her knowing about the debt and tax problems. He wanted her to think he was moving confidently into a business opportunity. I sat there with the paper in my hands for several minutes. 6 years earlier, I had read that request as embarrassment. I had agreed because I thought keeping my brother's private financial problems private was the decent thing to do. I still didn't think that decision had been wrong. What I had failed to understand was how useful that silence would become once Jake wanted a different version of the past. Mom never knew how badly he needed the liquidity. Chelsea never knew he had explicitly acknowledged that ownership was ending. The facts had remained exactly where they were, while Jake's explanation changed around them. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped wondering whether Jake had simply come to remember the transaction differently. People do that. Regret edits memory. Pride fills gaps. But this was not a vague recollection from a stressful year. I was holding his own words. When he needed the money, Jake understood the deal perfectly. The house would be mine. The cash would be his. He had chosen the restaurant because he believed that future mattered more. The story about me taking advantage of him had come later, after the restaurant failed and the property became worth far more than either of us had imagined. Jake and Chelsea came home from their honeymoon late Saturday afternoon. By then, Chelsea had stopped treating my email like an emotional reaction. She sent me one short message saying she was contacting a storage company and looking at furnished rentals because their apartment lease was almost over. Jake, apparently, had a different plan. According to Chelsea, he kept telling her not to panic, because the sale would never close once the buyers learned there were family complications. When she asked what those complications were, he still couldn't show her a deed, agreement, option, or anything else connecting his name to the property. He just kept saying I would eventually see reason. That evening, I sat in my office with the blue folder open beside me and admitted something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I had handled Jake's embarrassment carefully 6 years earlier because I thought privacy was kindness. Later, when I heard occasional comments about him regretting the sale, I dismissed them as resentment that would burn itself out. I corrected people when they said something directly false in front of me, But I never went searching for every distorted version Jake told when I wasn't in the room. I had believed facts were permanent enough to defend themselves. They weren't. Facts could sit untouched in a filing cabinet, while a more emotionally satisfying story moved through a family for years. That did not make Jake's lie my fault. I was clear about that even with myself. But I could see my own blind spot. I was good at solving problems that could be measured. Give me a contract, a budget, a deadline. I had seen Jake's regret and treated it like an inconvenience instead of recognizing what it was becoming. I had underestimated how badly he needed the outcome of that old decision to mean something other than that I had made the better investment. Sunday morning, I texted Jake and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. I chose a public place because I didn't want either of us storming through the other's front door, and I didn't invite our parents. This was between us first. Jake arrived 10 minutes late, still tanned from the honeymoon and visibly exhausted. He sat across from me without ordering anything and said, "Chelsea thinks we're homeless because of you." I told him Chelsea was looking for temporary housing because he had convinced her to give up their apartment for a house he did not own. He leaned back and crossed his arms. "You don't have to sell it. That's not the same as me owing it to you. You know what I mean." "No, Jake. That's been the problem all week. Everybody keeps telling me what I know without saying what they actually mean." He looked toward the window, jaw tight. I told him Chelsea now believed something that could be disproved with documents in less than 5 minutes. More importantly, she believed it because he had told her. I said I had no intention of humiliating him in front of the family, but I wasn't going to help him preserve a lie that involved my property. He had until that evening to tell his wife exactly what happened 6 years earlier. He could explain that he sold his share voluntarily, received the money, and never retained a right to reclaim the house. Jake laughed without humor. "And then what? I tell my wife I'm an idiot while you walk away with $6.8 million. There it was. Not grandma, not family tradition, not some invisible agreement everyone supposedly understood. Money. You sold your half for $1.55 million, he said. Now you're selling the whole place for 6.8. Tell me how that's fair." I reminded him that $1.55 million had been the appraised market value of his half at the time. I had taken on the financing required to buy him out. After that, I carried the property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and risk alone. I had put roughly $900,000 into major improvements over the years, including structural work, the dock, mechanical systems, and renovations. I had also spent 6 years owning an asset that could just as easily have lost value. Jake had taken his capital and chosen a restaurant. I had taken mine and chosen real estate. One investment failed, the other appreciated. That did not retroactively make the original transaction unfair. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Turn everything into a presentation where you're the smartest person at the table." I started to answer, then stopped, because there was enough truth in that accusation to deserve better than reflexive denial. I told him I knew I could be clinical. I knew there had been times when he came to me ashamed or scared, and I responded with spreadsheets, payment schedules, and solutions when he probably wanted his sister to acknowledge that he was hurting. I had also been condescending sometimes. I had looked at some of his choices and thought they were reckless, and I hadn't always hidden that well. Jake stared at me, almost surprised I had admitted it. Then he said, "Exactly." "No," I said. "Not exactly. Me being condescending doesn't give you ownership of my house." His expression hardened again. I asked him when he first told Chelsea the lake house would eventually be theirs. He resisted, then finally admitted it had started early in their relationship. At first, he said, it wasn't a promise. He had taken Chelsea there, watched how much she loved the place, and said something like, "Someday we'll probably end up here." She had asked what he meant, and he told her the house was technically in my name, but had always been family property. The first exaggeration had been small enough that he didn't think of it as a lie. Then Chelsea started imagining holidays there. She talked about children learning to swim off the dock and which room would make the best nursery. By the time they were engaged, Jake had stopped saying probably. The story became something that would happen once he was married and settled. Every time Chelsea asked how it would work, he gave her another reassuring answer. Admitting the truth later would have meant admitting that part of the future she loved had been built on something he never had the power to promise. "So you kept going," I said. He rubbed both hands over his face. "I thought you'd work with me." "You mean give you the house?" "I thought you'd make something work." That distinction told me everything. Jake had never believed he legally owned the lake house. He believed I could be pressured into making his story true. He had spent years watching me solve problems for the family, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped distinguishing between my ability to rescue someone and my obligation to do it. I gave him one final option. I told him to go home and tell Chelsea the truth before dinner. Put the furniture into storage, find temporary housing, stop telling Mom or anyone else that I stole anything from him. If he did those things, I would keep the old emails where they had been for 6 years. I wasn't interested in distributing his financial history around the family. The documents would remain what they had always been: records, not weapons. Jake looked at me for a long time. Then he shook his head. "You don't mean that." "I do." "No, you don't. You always fix things when they get bad enough." I watched him walk out of the coffee shop and finally understood the plan beneath every lie he had told. Jake wasn't waiting for proof that the house belonged to him. He was waiting for the consequences to become painful enough that I would rescue him from them. The closing happened on Monday, 9 days after the wedding. By late afternoon, the buyers had signed, the funds had cleared through the closing process, and possession transferred according to the contract. I walked through the lake house one last time before turning over the keys. The place looked almost unfamiliar without my things in it. The rooms were quiet, the dock was empty, and the kitchen where Jake and I had argued over contractor estimates 6 years earlier was spotless. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Chelsea had told me over the weekend that she was arranging storage for their furniture and looking at furnished rentals. That was the responsible thing to do, and I assumed she had finally accepted what I had told her. What I did not know until later was that Jake had spent Monday telling her the opposite. He said he had spoken to me after our meeting and that I had backed down. According to Chelsea, he told her the sale had hit a complication, the buyers would not take possession, and the family was working something out. He never showed her anything in writing. By then, she should have demanded it. She later admitted that herself. But their old lease was ending, the moving company was already booked, and Jake offered her the one answer that made everything easier. She chose to believe him. The movers had originally been told to take their belongings to storage. Tuesday morning, Jake changed the destination. I learned that detail later from Chelsea because I was not at the lake house when they arrived. I was at work 40 miles away, reviewing documents for another property, when my phone first started vibrating on the conference table. I ignored the first call because it was from Jake. I ignored the second because it was also from Jake. When Chelsea's name appeared a few minutes later, I stepped out of the meeting. Before I answered, I saw a message from my broker. The buyers had contacted him because a moving truck had pulled into the driveway and a couple was claiming they were supposed to move in. The buyers were confused but calm. Nobody had forced entry. Nobody had called police. The truck was still outside. My broker asked whether I knew who they were, and I closed my eyes for a second because I already knew the answer. I called Chelsea back. Her voice was lower than I expected. There was no screaming. In some ways, that made it worse. "Lauren," she said, "did Jake ever own half this house?" I leaned against the hallway wall outside the conference room and told her the truth. Yes, he did. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear voices and the low rumble of a truck behind her. Then she asked, "Does he own any of it now?" I said, "No. He hasn't for 6 years." Chelsea didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, she asked whether the buyers standing on the deck were really the owners. I told her the sale had closed the day before, and possession had transferred. The house was theirs. She asked if there was any possibility that Jake still had some claim, family agreement, right to buy back in, anything he could be relying on. I told her there wasn't. I had already told her that in writing, and I wasn't going to soften it now, just because she was standing in the driveway. She said, "He told me you stopped the sale." I didn't. He said there was a problem with closing. There wasn't. He said you two worked something out. We didn't. Each answer seemed to make the silence on her end longer. Then Chelsea said something I hadn't expected. "He changed the moving address last night. I had storage booked." That was when I realized she had actually taken my warning seriously. Not completely, but enough to make another plan. Jake had undone it. He had waited until the last possible moment, told her he had fixed everything, and redirected the truck toward a house he knew had never belonged to him. I asked where Jake was. Chelsea said he was standing near the driveway talking to the moving supervisor. I could hear irritation in the background, then Jake's voice getting louder. He was apparently telling the movers there had been a misunderstanding and asking them to wait. Chelsea lowered her voice further. "The woman who owns the house asked me who told us we could move in." I didn't know what to say. I told her she didn't owe the buyers an explanation of 6 years of family history. She only needed to get the truck off their property and figure out where her belongings were going. Chelsea gave a short, humorless laugh. "You sound very calm. I've been telling you the same thing for 9 days." That landed harder than if I had shouted at her. Chelsea said she knew. Then she ended the call, because the moving company needed a destination. I went back into my meeting, but I barely heard the first 5 minutes. Part of me was angry enough to want details immediately. Another part of me understood that whatever was happening in that driveway no longer required my participation. I had sold the property legally. I had warned them in writing. I had warned Chelsea directly. I had given Jake a final chance to tell the truth after he came home. There was nothing left for me to fix. The full story reached me in pieces later that day. When the truck first pulled up, Chelsea had seen a couple sitting on the deck with coffee and breakfast. She assumed they were guests, contractors, or possibly representatives of the buyers Jake claimed had not completed the purchase. She walked toward them and said they were moving in. The woman looked confused and told her, "We live here." Chelsea apparently stopped walking. Then she turned to Jake and asked what was going on. Jake tried 3 explanations in less than 5 minutes. First, he said the closing must have happened without him being notified. Then he said there was still a family dispute. Finally, when the buyer's husband explained that they had closed the previous day and had the recorded ownership documents from the transaction, Jake said Lauren had rushed the sale through. That was the explanation he settled on, because it allowed him to remain the victim. He had not promised something that wasn't his. I had supposedly moved faster than he expected. The new owners behaved better than Jake deserved. They did not humiliate him, threaten him, or make some theatrical speech about trespassing. They simply told him they had purchased the property legally and needed the moving truck removed from their driveway. My broker confirmed the same thing over the phone. The movers, who had no interest in a family dispute, asked Jake and Chelsea where to take the furniture. Chelsea gave them the address of the storage facility she had booked before Jake changed the plan. Jake called me again while the truck was leaving. This time I answered. He didn't bother pretending anymore. "You knew we were coming today." "No," I said. "I knew Chelsea had booked storage." "You could have stopped this." He tried. "You could have called me last night. I met you in person and told you the truth." He said I had made him look like a liar in front of his wife and 2 strangers. I reminded him that I hadn't sent him there. I hadn't changed the truck's destination. I hadn't told Chelsea closing had failed. Every decision that put him in that driveway had been his. Then he said the sentence I had been waiting to hear without realizing it. "What are we supposed to do now?" There it was again. Not, "What should I do?" Not, "How do I fix this?" He still meant we. He still believed his disaster had become a shared family problem the moment it became expensive enough. I told him to take the furniture to storage and find somewhere to stay until they arranged permanent housing. Jake said temporary rentals were expensive. I told him I knew. He said Chelsea was furious and barely speaking to him. I told him I couldn't fix that. He asked whether I could at least cover a hotel for a couple of weeks, just until things settled down. For most of my adult life, that was the moment when I would have opened my banking app, found a number that made the emergency disappear, and told myself I was helping my family. This time I heard my own answer before I had time to make it softer. "No, Jake." He went silent. Then he asked, almost incredulously, "You're really going to leave us like this?" "I didn't leave you anywhere. You drove there." He hung up on me. Chelsea called again that evening. She wasn't crying, but the exhaustion in her voice had changed into something colder. She told me Jake was still insisting I had caused everything by refusing to honor what the family intended. Then she asked me another question. "When he sold his half to you, did he know it was permanent?" I looked at the blue folder sitting on the corner of my desk. I thought about the email in Jake's own words, the one saying that once he signed, the house would be mine. "Yes," I said. "And I can prove it." Chelsea was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "I think I need to see that." Chelsea did not ask me for the old emails that night. Instead, she asked me a more important question. "If I ask you something about Jake's finances, will you tell me the truth?" I said I would answer anything that involved my transaction with him, but I would not turn 6 years of private financial information into ammunition for a marriage fight. If Jake had debts she needed to know about as his wife, that was a conversation he owed her. I wasn't going to become the person who emptied his file cabinet onto the table because I was angry. Chelsea accepted that, although I could hear the frustration in her voice. By Wednesday, the practical consequences had arrived. Their old apartment lease was ending, so their furniture stayed in storage while they moved into a short-term furnished rental. Neither of them was destitute. Jake had a solid job managing restaurant operations for a regional hospitality group, and Chelsea worked in event marketing. They could afford temporary housing. What hurt was paying for storage, another move, a deposit on a new rental, and several weeks of inflated short-term rates, after spending heavily on a wedding and honeymoon. It was exactly the kind of expensive inconvenience Jake had spent years assuming someone else would absorb if things went wrong. Chelsea called me again that evening. This time she sounded different, less embarrassed, more methodical. She told me she had asked Jake to sit down with her and show her their real financial position. Not estimates. Not what he thought they could afford next year. Actual account balances, debts, credit cards, savings, and what remained from their wedding expenses. Jake had accused her of treating him like a criminal. Chelsea told him that asking your husband what the two of you owed was not an interrogation. He responded by saying none of this would be happening if I hadn't sold the house. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "That's his answer to everything right now," I said. Chelsea admitted she was beginning to notice that. She asked about the original buyout money. I told her the part I could verify directly. Jake received approximately $1.55 million for his half of the property in 2020. The amount came from an independent appraisal, not a number I invented. I told her that some of the money went toward obligations he was already carrying, and that a substantial amount supported the restaurant venture. When she asked exactly how much debt he had at the time, I stopped her. "That's where you need to ask your husband," I said. "I know things because he asked me for help years ago. That doesn't make them mine to disclose." Chelsea went quiet, then said, "He told me almost all of that money disappeared into old debt before the restaurant even opened." "That's not how I remember it." "Can you prove that?" "I can prove what I paid him. I can prove what he said the transaction meant. I can answer questions about documents he gave me if he agrees. But I'm not going to diagnose your marriage for you." She sounded irritated, but I preferred that to becoming her instant ally against Jake. Chelsea had ignored warning signs because she liked what Jake was promising. She had also stood in a ballroom and publicly thanked me for a house she had never confirmed was hers. The fact that Jake had lied did not erase her responsibility for that. If she wanted the truth now, she needed to do some of the work herself. Jake made sure Mom heard a very different version. Susan called me Thursday morning furious that I was dragging Chelsea into old money problems. I asked how I had dragged Chelsea anywhere when Chelsea was the one asking questions after Jake redirected a moving truck to someone else's house. Mom said I knew exactly what I was doing by showing Chelsea that Jake had once owned the property. I told her Chelsea had already known that part. What she hadn't known was that Jake no longer had any right to it. Mom lowered her voice. You don't have to destroy his marriage just because you're angry. Did I tell Chelsea to leave him? No, but did I call her and tell her to search his finances? No. Did I redirect the moving truck? Susan stopped answering. I told her I had answered factual questions about property I owned. Jake's marriage was reacting to what Jake had told his wife, not to anything I had invented. Mom said Chelsea was emotional and newly married, and that I should give Jake room to fix things privately. I asked whether fix things privately meant I should help maintain the version he had already told her. She said that wasn't what she meant. I told her, then we agreed. I would not interfere, but I would not lie either. That night, Chelsea began doing something she should have done months earlier. She searched her own messages, not Jake's phone, not his email, her own conversation history with the man she had just married. She later told me she started with the phrase, lake house, and worked backward. What she found changed the problem completely. The earliest messages were vague. Jake called it our family place. He told her I handled the property because I was better with that kind of thing. Later, his wording became more definite. In one exchange from the year before the wedding, Chelsea had asked whether I might sell. Jake replied that I couldn't make that decision without dealing with him because the property was still tied to a family understanding. In another, Chelsea asked when they would know the house was theirs. Jake wrote that getting married would finally make it clear to everyone that he was settled and ready to take responsibility for it again. Then she found the messages involving my mother. Chelsea had once asked whether Susan knew about their plan. Jake responded that Mom fully supported the understanding and had always believed the lake house should eventually come back to him. That wasn't exactly what Susan had told me. Mom believed Jake deserved another chance. Jake had converted that belief into evidence that an arrangement existed. By Friday afternoon, Chelsea sent me several screenshots. I read them twice before replying. They were worse than I expected, because they were not emotional statements like Lauren got the better deal. They were factual claims. Jake had told Chelsea I was holding his share. He had told her marriage would trigger the next step. He had told her I could not simply sell without involving him. He had told her Mom supported the arrangement as something already understood. These were not the words of a man vaguely remembering an old transaction differently. They were specific enough that Chelsea had organized housing decisions around them. I called her and asked whether Jake knew she had found the messages. She said yes. She had put several on the table in front of him and asked him to explain them. Jake did not deny sending them. He said he had been describing what the family intended, not legal ownership. Chelsea asked why he told her I couldn't sell without him if he knew that wasn't true. According to her, Jake answered that he never thought I actually would. That sentence mattered more than he probably realized. It meant the lie had never depended on his misunderstanding the paperwork. It depended on his assumption that my behavior would eventually rescue the claim. Chelsea told me she had made a decision. She was taking the furnished rental in her own name for the next month, and Jake could decide where he wanted to stay. Their belongings would remain in storage until they had a permanent address. More importantly, she was separating their day-to-day finances and would not sign another lease, loan, or large purchase with him until he gave her complete disclosure of their debts and accounts. She was not filing for divorce. She wasn't even sure she wanted the marriage to end, but she said she could not make another financial decision beside a man when she no longer knew which parts of their future had been based on facts. I didn't congratulate her. I didn't tell her she was doing the right thing. That was her marriage, and I wasn't interested in turning Jake's collapse into a friendship between the two women he had misled. I only said, "You need to make whatever decision you can live with after you're no longer angry." Before we ended the call, Chelsea asked if she could send me one more screenshot. It was a message Jake had written months before the wedding. He told her not to worry about my hesitation, because I always became difficult when money and paperwork were involved, but once he was married, I would have to acknowledge what everyone had understood all along. Chelsea waited until I finished reading it. Then she asked, "Do you have anything from 2020 that shows what he believed back then?" I looked across my office at the blue folder. For 6 years, Jake's old words and his new ones had existed in different worlds. Chelsea had just handed me the bridge between them. By the third Saturday after the wedding, my mother had decided the family needed to sit down together. Susan called it a conversation, but I knew what she wanted. She wanted the tension gone, Chelsea back with Jake, and everyone behaving normally again. More specifically, she wanted me to do what I had done many times before, absorb enough discomfort that everybody else could stop feeling it. I agreed to come, but I brought the blue folder with me. There were only 5 of us at my parents' house. Mom, Dad, Jake, Chelsea, and me. Chelsea arrived separately from Jake and sat at the opposite end of the table. That told me more than anything she could have said. Jake looked tired and angry, while Mom had arranged coffee and food as if a familiar setting could turn the last 3 weeks into a misunderstanding. Dad sat beside her with both hands around his mug and barely looked at anyone. Mom started before I had even taken the documents out of my bag. She said she understood the paperwork was in my name and that Jake had technically sold his share, but she believed I had taken advantage of a moment when he was financially vulnerable. According to her, Jake had been young, frightened about his future, and desperate to make the restaurant work. I had been the older, more financially experienced sibling, so I should have understood that he might regret giving up something so valuable. Then, she said, instead of giving him a genuine chance to make things right years later, I had quietly sold the house and left him and his new wife scrambling for somewhere to live. I let her finish. A few years earlier, I probably would have interrupted after the second sentence and turned the conversation into an argument about definitions. This time, I wanted the entire story out in the room. When Mom stopped, I asked, "Is that what you believe happened?" She said yes. Then I looked at Jake and asked whether that was his version too. He shrugged and said it was close enough. I opened the blue folder. Then, let's start with the first part. I put the independent appraisal on the table and turned it toward Mom. I reminded her that an outside professional had valued the entire property at approximately $3.1 million before the buyout. Jake's half was worth about $1.55 million, and that was the figure used in the transaction. There had been no family discount, and no number I invented because Jake needed money quickly. Mom looked at the pages, then said, "That doesn't change the fact that he was desperate." I didn't say it did. Next came the settlement statement and proof of payment. I explained only what each document actually established. The closing statement showed the terms of the transaction and that it had been handled through a normal, formal process. The payment record showed that Jake received what the agreement required. I did not wave the pages around or tell everyone the documents proved Jake had been happy. They didn't. They proved he sold his interest and was paid for it. Jake leaned forward. "Fine. I got paid. Nobody is denying that. 3 weeks ago, people were saying, 'I took the house from you.' I was under pressure." That was his first retreat. He had moved from claiming something had been taken to admitting he had sold it, but insisting his circumstances changed the meaning. I reached for the next page. That's why this matters. It was the email I had sent before closing. I had told Jake there was no deadline coming from me. If he wanted more time, we could pause. If he wanted to keep his half and continue sharing the costs, we could do that. I had even told him we could discuss selling the entire property on the open market if he preferred. Jake's reply was underneath mine. He said he had made his decision and wanted to proceed. Jake read the email without touching it. Then he said, "You knew I'd regret it." "I knew you might." He looked at me as if that admission helped him. "Exactly. No. Knowing someone may regret a decision doesn't mean they don't get to make it." He pushed back from the table. "You always have an answer." I told him I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was answering one accusation at a time. If he wanted to say he regretted selling, I believed him. If he wanted to say the restaurant had failed and watching the property rise in value hurt, I believed that too. But regret did not create an ownership interest 6 years later. Then I took out the email that had stayed in the blue folder since 2020, The room felt different before anyone even read it because Chelsea knew what was coming. Jake did too. I placed the page in front of him and pointed to his own words. He had written that once he signed, he understood the house would belong to me. He said he needed the cash more than he needed property, and believed his future was in the restaurant. Mom stopped moving. Dad looked down at the table. Jake stared at the email for several seconds, and finally said, "That was 6 years ago." "Yes," I said. "That's the point." Chelsea reached into her bag and put her phone on the table. She had printed several screenshots rather than passing the phone around. In the newer messages, Jake told her I was only holding his share. He told her I could not truly sell the property without dealing with him. He told her that once they were married, everyone would have to acknowledge that the house was supposed to come back to him. Chelsea placed one of those messages beside the old email. "Which one was true?" she asked. Jake looked at her. "Both, depending on what you mean." Chelsea shook her head. "No. That's what you've been doing to me for weeks. When something is written down, suddenly, the words mean something." Jake said he had been talking about the spirit of the family arrangement, not legal ownership. I reminded him that he had told Chelsea I could not sell without him. That was not a feeling. It was a factual claim, and he knew it was false because he had already signed the very documents proving otherwise. Dad finally spoke. His voice was quieter than mine, but it changed the room. "I told you this years ago." Jake looked at him. Michael said that after the restaurant began struggling, he had heard Jake complaining that I had ended up with the house and pulled him aside. "I told you to stop talking like Lauren stole it. You sold it." Jake's face hardened. "And look what it's worth now." Dad nodded once. "That's regret. It isn't theft." For several seconds, nobody said anything. That was the first moment I felt the family story actually break. Not because of one spectacular revelation, but because there was nowhere left for Jake to move. The appraisal answered the claim that I had underpaid him. The settlement and transfer answered the claim that nothing real had happened. My pre-closing email answered the claim that I rushed him. His own acknowledgement destroyed the idea that I was temporarily holding his share. Chelsea's messages showed that years later he had told her the opposite anyway. Mom looked more wounded than angry now. She said she had only been trying to protect Jake because he had always needed more help than I did. "You were stronger, Lauren. You always figured things out." I felt something in me go still. Being stronger never made me less your daughter. Mom looked down. I told her I understood why she had worried about Jake. I understood why Dad avoided correcting every comment because he thought everybody knew the truth. I even understood why Jake hated the decision he had made. What I would no longer accept was being turned into the price of keeping him comfortable. "I don't need everybody to apologize," I said. "I need everybody to stop repeating something they now know isn't true." Nobody argued with that. The meeting ended without hugs or a dramatic reconciliation. Chelsea left first. Jake stayed behind for a few minutes, talking quietly with Mom in the kitchen while I packed the documents back into the blue folder. As I was walking toward the front door, I heard him tell her the temporary rental was draining their money and the storage bill was higher than expected. He asked if she could help with the deposit on a cheaper apartment. For years, that question would have started a familiar chain. Mom would worry. Dad would stay quiet. Then someone would eventually call me, because I was the one who could solve it fastest. This time, Susan looked at Jake for a long moment and said, "No, Jake. You'll have to figure this one out." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see his face to know what had just changed. For the first time, the consequences of one of Jake's decisions had reached him without being handed to somebody else. Over the next several weeks, nothing dramatic happened, which was exactly why the consequences finally mattered. Jake and Chelsea moved their furniture out of storage and into a smaller rental they could actually afford. They returned some of the pieces they had ordered for the lake house, lost deposits on others, and paid fees they never would have faced if Jake had told the truth before the wedding. Nobody went bankrupt. Nobody slept in a car. They simply had to absorb the cost of decisions made around a house that was never theirs. Chelsea kept the furnished rental in her name for almost a month, before deciding whether she was ready to live with Jake again. She told me very little about their marriage after that, and I did not ask. What I did know was that she required complete financial disclosure before she would sign another lease with him. She wanted account balances, debts, credit cards, and actual income rather than promises about what he expected to earn later. She also separated the money she brought into the marriage from their shared spending until she understood exactly what she had married into. She wasn't filing for divorce. She wasn't promising to stay either. For once, Jake had to live without knowing whether charm and reassurance would be enough to restore trust. About 2 weeks after the family meeting, he called me. His voice sounded calmer than it had in months. He said he had found a reasonable apartment, but the deposit, moving fees, storage charges, and everything else were hitting at once. Then he told me Chelsea was refusing to combine finances again until they finished counseling and reviewed everything together. He sounded insulted by that, as if transparency were a punishment rather than the minimum price of rebuilding trust. "I need a little breathing room," he said. "Just enough to get through this month." I knew what he was asking before he said the number. It was not an amount that would have hurt me. That was part of what made the moment dangerous. It would have been easy to tell myself that helping him now was different because he had already learned his lesson. I could have transferred the money in minutes and removed one more consequence from his path. "You could fix this," Jake said. I looked at the lake house closing statement sitting in a stack beside my desk and thought about how many times that sentence had shaped our family without anyone saying it so plainly. I could fix the hotel. I could cover storage. I could pay the deposit. I could make Mom stop worrying. I could give Chelsea one less reason to be angry. I could once again become the bridge between Jake and the results of his choices. "I could pay for it," I said. "That's not the same thing." He went quiet. I told him I was not trying to punish him. I wasn't withholding money because I wanted him to suffer. He had a job. Chelsea had a job. They had enough income to find housing, even if it was smaller than what they wanted. What they did not have anymore was the imaginary safety net of my lake house or my bank account. "I won't punish you, Jake," I said, "but I'm done protecting you from yourself." He didn't yell. That surprised me. He only said, "You really mean that now, don't you?" "I do." The conversation ended without either of us pretending everything was fine. Strangely, that felt healthier than most of our conversations had in years. Dad came to see me a few days later. Michael had never been the kind of person who apologized with speeches, and he did not start then. He sat at my kitchen counter, drank half a cup of coffee, and finally said, "I should have shut this down earlier." I knew exactly what he meant. He had understood the original sale. He had even corrected Jake privately, years ago. But whenever Mom softened the story or Jake complained, Dad chose silence because he thought refusing to participate made him neutral. "I thought staying out of it would keep things from getting worse," he said. "It didn't," I told him. "It made Mom and Jake louder." He nodded. There was no argument, which was probably why I believed the apology. Dad said he had spent years assuming facts eventually won on their own. I laughed because I had made the same mistake. The difference was that Dad's silence had given Mom's version more room, while mine had allowed Jake to build an entirely new future around a lie. Mom took longer. She did not suddenly become a different person after one family meeting. She still worried about Jake more than she worried about me. She still called to tell me when he was stressed, as if his stress were information I was responsible for acting on. The difference was that I stopped responding to those calls by reaching for solutions. I listened when I wanted to listen. I ended the conversation when it became pressure. The change I noticed came almost 2 months after the wedding. We were having dinner at my parents' house when Jake made another bitter comment about the lake house. He said something about how I had made millions off what should have been ours. Before I could respond, Mom put down her fork. "No," she said. "She made money from what she bought." Jake stared at her. Susan looked uncomfortable, but she didn't take it back. The conversation moved on a few minutes later, and nobody applauded her for saying it. That was why the moment mattered. She wasn't defending me because a folder of evidence was sitting on the table. She corrected him because she finally understood that repeating his version was no longer kindness. I changed a few things after that. I stopped lending family money without written terms, even for small amounts. I stopped agreeing to rescue expenses created by decisions someone had knowingly made. I refused to participate in vague conversations about family property. If ownership mattered, paperwork mattered. And if someone told a false financial story about me in front of other people, I corrected it when I heard it, instead of assuming the truth would somehow catch up later. Jake and Chelsea stayed married through the first 3 months after the wedding, but their future was theirs to decide. Chelsea never apologized for the microphone announcement in some grand emotional scene. She did something better. The next time a relative mentioned how generous I had been to almost give them the lake house, Chelsea corrected the person herself. She said there had never been a gift and that she should have confirmed the truth before announcing one. I respected that more than tears. As for the lake house, the new owners kept it. My broker told me they loved the dock in the mornings and were already planning their first family Thanksgiving there. Hearing that did not hurt the way I expected. The house had been important to me, but ownership had never been the same thing as memory. Grandma was not trapped inside a deed, and selling the property did not erase the summers we had spent there. One evening, while cleaning out my office, I found the blue closing folder again. For weeks it had felt like evidence, almost like a weapon I needed nearby in case someone challenged reality again. This time, it was just an old file. I checked that the digital copies were stored where they belonged, put the folder back into the cabinet, and closed the drawer. Jake had not lost the lake house at his wedding. He had sold his share 6 years earlier. What he lost after the wedding was the story that someone else had done it to him. Chelsea stopped accepting promises without proof. Mom stopped repeating his grievance as fact. Dad stopped treating silence as neutrality. And I stopped confusing love with rescue. For the first time in years, my brother's life was his to manage, and mine was finally mine to keep. You can love your family without paying for every mistake they make. When someone rewrites the past, promises what belongs to you, or expects you to rescue them from consequences, protect yourself with clear boundaries, written agreements, and honest conversations. Being capable does not make you responsible for carrying everyone else. You should help when help is healthy, not when it rewards deception or entitlement. Most importantly, never let guilt pressure you into surrendering what you earned or legally own. If this story reminded you to protect your peace and your future, subscribe to the channel for more family stories.